This video is brought to you by Brilliant. This week, anti-government protesters in Kenya poured onto the streets of Nairobi and across the country to protest a controversial finance bill that aims to raise $2.7 billion through new controversial tax measures required as part of a new IMF loan. After the government passed the bill on Tuesday, the protests quickly turned violent. The Kenyan parliament was stormed and security forces opened fire on protesters, leaving at least 5 people dead and 200 injured. So, in this video, we're going to take a brief look at Kenya's debt crisis, the controversial finance bill, and whether the IMF is to blame.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop when we release new videos.
Now, to understand this story, we should probably go back to the 2022 Kenyan presidential election. The two main candidates in the election were William Ruto, then the deputy president, and Raila Odinga, who was backed by the incumbent president Kenyatta. The election was a pretty disheartening experience. Neither candidate really focused much on policies, and all the candidates are veterans of Kenyan politics. Odinga had run for president 4 times previously and lost to Kenyatta in 2017, before joining forces with him a year later, which didn't go down well with Ruto. For his part, Ruto has been Odinga's deputy in 2007, and then switched sides to Kenyatta for the 2013 and 2017 elections. This sort of horse trading is par for the course in Kenyan politics. In total, Odinga has belonged to 6 political parties, Ruto to 5 and Kenyatta to 4. Structurally, Kenya's political shortcomings are in part because of a lot of Kenyan politics runs along ethnic lines, which means politicians often focus on ethnic grievances rather than policies. But it's also because the country is struggling to overcome its legacy as a one-party state. For context, between basically independence until 2002, the Kenya African National Union, or KANU, was the country's only legally permitted political party. Despite falling apart after the 2002 elections, KANU still sort of dominates Kenyan politics. At every election since, both the winners and runners-up have been former members, and no other stable political party has emerged. The fact that Kenyan politics has been dominated by the same narrow set of elites for the best part of 2 decades has created a fair bit of antipathy towards politics, which is one of the reasons protests have become so common. Anyway, in the end, Ruto won by a narrow 50.5% majority, and he was immediately pitched into an economic crisis. At the time, in part thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, food and energy prices were spiking, causing a cost of living crisis. The previous government had tried to mitigate this crisis and assuage voters by subsidizing certain goods, including fuel and maize flour. But this had pushed Kenya's annual deficit up to about 6% of GDP. Kenya's national debt had reached 70% of GDP, essentially doubling in the past decade. Now, that might not sound too high if you live in Europe or the US, where many countries today have debt-to-GDP ratios well above 100%. But wealthier countries can generally tolerate higher debt burdens than poorer ones, and 70% is pretty high for an economy as poor as Kenya. For context, Kenya has a GDP per capita of roughly $2,000, about half that of Namibia and a third that of Botswana. In 2022, Kenya's debt-to-GDP ratio was significantly higher than both its neighbours and peer economies, like Nigeria, the Ivory Coast and Mauritania, which all have similar GDP per capitas. Kenya's debt crisis became particularly acute in 2023, when interest rates started rising across the world, and Kenya has had to go to the IMF for bailouts multiple times since the pandemic. Importantly, these bailout loans come with conditions, i.e. the IMF says, will only bail you out if you balance your budget, usually via austerity measures. Almost immediately after taking office, Ruto scrapped both the fuel and maize flour subsidies, arguing that the subsidies were both regressive and required by IMF conditionality. Even if both of these things are true, the subsidies withdrawal still caused a sharp spike in inflation and triggered widespread anti-government protests. Ruto eventually U-turned, but only after an aggressive security crackdown which killed dozens of protesters and ended up having to go to the IMF for yet another loan this year. And this takes us to the controversial finance bill. The IMF said they'd give Kenya more money, but only if it balanced the budget. And that's what the finance bill was supposed to do, by raising $2.7 billion in additional taxes over the next 12 months. Now, we should mention that Ruto's government did drop some of the more contentious proposals, following widespread outrage when the bill was first announced. The original bill, for instance, included new levies on basic commodities, like a 16% sales tax on bread and 25% duty on vegetable oil, as well as a controversial annual tax on vehicle ownership, amounting to 2.5% of the value of the vehicle. There was even an eco-levy proposed on non-environmentally friendly manufactured goods, including sanitary towels, diapers, and mobile phones. But while these measures were all reversed, the bill was still pretty dramatic and included controversial measures like a 16% tax on goods and services used by specialized hospitals, and an increase in the general import tax from 2.5% to 3%. When the bill passed Parliament, protesters invaded Parliament, setting fire to parts of it and triggering a violent crackdown from the security forces. Ruto, who's now extraordinarily unpopular in Kenya, faced calls to resign, but vowed to stay on and restore order. But this will be difficult, because unlike previous protests, which were led by Odinga, these protests don't really have a leadership structure. They're spontaneously organized by young Kenyans on social media, so stemming them won't be easy, although Ruto is apparently trying to by shutting down the internet. This affair has also sparked a heated debate about IMF conditionality, with many of the protesters blaming the IMF for imposing austerity conditions. Whilst it's probably true that the IMF's austerity policies are in many cases both ineffective and blind to the risks of political instability, the IMF would argue that austerity measures are the only way of balancing the books quickly, and that it would be a moral hazard to lend unconditionally. They might also point out that the alternative to an IMF loan is bankruptcy, which is probably worse than austerity. However, from a certain point of view, the main reason countries like Kenya have to go to the IMF is that negotiating with creditors has become way too difficult. The main issue Kenya is having is that interest payments on its debt, which now account for a ridiculous 38% of all revenues. In the past, when countries mainly borrowed from a handful of Western countries, Kenya would be able to easily renegotiate these extortionate loans. But today, restructurings are way more complicated because countries borrow from a whole range of creditors. And in many cases, these creditors, often China and the West, can't agree on who gets what. In this light, creating a new forum for restructuring might be more effective than bashing the IMF.
Looking around the political stage, there's a good number of people who are probably eyeing up new jobs at the moment. So it might be a good time for Rishi & Co to grab a subscription to Brilliant. That's because Brilliant is the platform where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI, all of which are important skills whether you're currently in the jobs market or just looking to learn new things. As existing users will already know, Brilliant is a uniquely effective learning platform. Their first principles approach helps you build understanding from the ground up. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with concepts, a method proven to be 6 times more effective than watching lecture videos. Plus, if you are looking for a new job, say you're eyeing up a move to California to get into tech, Brilliant's growing number of programming courses are a great way to build foundations and learn real-world applications. Their courses help you learn essential coding elements, from loops and variables to nesting and conditionals, as well as developing your mind to think like a programmer, building a strong foundation in writing robust programs. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, click on the link in the description. Plus, when you do subscribe, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.